Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. I'm Scott Thumma, the director of the Hartford Institute for Religion Research and a professor of sociology of religion at Hartford International University. This is our final lunchtime webinar of the semester, hosted by the Institute and HIU. Today, we're excited to hear several presentations and have a conversation about trends in small churches, specifically in the Episcopal Church and the United Church of Christ. This discussion, small church, large presence, will draw on denominational data from both groups and also on our 25 years of collaborative research in the organization called Faith Communities Today, as well as on the Institute's 5-year project exploring the pandemic impact on congregations, which is collecting and disseminating information about changes and long-term implications of COVID-19 on the religious life. We're very happy to welcome you here today and invite you to join in this conversation on what these researchers have learned about small churches and then the response of several pastors within some of these churches. Should be a great conversation today. But let me introduce our presenters first. We have Reverend Dr. Molly James, who is the Deputy Executive Officer of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, and also is Director of their research for the denomination. She formerly served on the bishop's staff in the Episcopal Church in Connecticut as Dean of Formation and was ordained in 2005 and has served as a parish priest. I must say she's also an adjunct at Hartford International, and she's also the co-director of Faith Communities Today. Additionally, we're joined by Dr. Erica Dolhoff, who is the director of the United Church of Christ Center for Analytics, Research, Development, and Data, or CARD. And prior to that, she was a postdoc at the Institute as well. We have a whole collection of friends here today. She was also, before that, a senior research associate with the Association for Religion Data Archives. So we'll hear from them, but then we'll also hear some insights from 3 different clergy from the denominations that we discussed today. First, we have a Reverend Rebecca Hatch, who is the rector at St. Albans Episcopal Church, and soon to be canon for the lay and ordained vocations in the Connecticut Diocese. She's also a co-founder of Small Churches Big Impact Collective, which works to connect small church leaders and to amplify the experience of smaller congregations and their leadership. We'll also hear from Reverend Stacy Williams Duncan, rector of Little Fork Episcopal Church in Rixieville, Virginia, and is a consultant for Lead Connects. And then finally, we'll also hear from Reverend Dr. Sandra Fisher, who is the designated term minister at East Granby Congregational Church in Connecticut, and the founder of Congregation Collaboration, a consulting company that supports churches in discovering creative multi-church solutions to provide vital ministries to their communities. And she's also an alumni of Hartford International. We are sure to be stimulated, I think, by these great presentations, but first, let me draw your attention to the fact that throughout the presentations, you can use the Q&A chat feature to raise questions that come to mind during the session. And then we'll try to answer as many of those as we can during our Q&A time. So with that long introduction out of the way, let's begin. And let me turn to Reverend Dr. James. Take it away, Molly.
Wonderful to be with you all and to talk about something near and dear to Erica's and my work and to our hearts and our passion for our congregations in the UCC and in the Episcopal Church. So we will be sharing what we are learning from, as Scott said, from our own data, as well as the wonderful collaborations we are very glad to be able to participate in. So I will start with some context and data about the Episcopal Church, And then Erica will do the same for the UCC. And then we will look at vitality data more broadly and finally share some insights from the data overall. So I want to begin, we will begin today with the context of the Episcopal Church. So we are an international church. We stretch all the way west to a diocese in Taiwan. We have a couple of parishes in Guam, diocese in Hawaii and Alaska, and then all the way east to our convocation of Episcopal churches in Europe, with a congregation as far east as Tbilisi, Georgia. And then south into much of the Caribbean, Honduras, and then dioceses in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia. Of course, the vast majority of our congregations are here in the United States. And I always think it's good to have this visual because it reminds us how concentrated our congregations are in the east and the south of the United States. Now, in comparison to many other denominations, we are not large. We are about 2 million, a little less than 2 million people. We do have some historical clout, though, that might be worth noticing, which means we can sometimes still have an outsized influence on the political and social spheres. Note that the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. is an Episcopal cathedral. It's the Cathedral of the Diocese of Washington. St. John's Lafayette Square, which has made news headlines in recent years, is our church. And over the course of the American history, 1 in 4 American presidents have been Episcopalian, about a third of Congress, and close to half the Supreme Court justices historically, not currently. We also have the opportunity to make an impact because of our financial resources. Despite declines in attendance and membership over recent years, our congregational giving has remained relatively high, all things considered, and it is still above $1 billion. And that is only our plate and pledge, if you will, our giving, not the significant endowments of the Episcopal Church, both at the local congregational and the diocesan level. So we'll dig a little here into our numbers. This is looking at our baptism, marriage, and funerals over the last 40 plus years. It's worth noting the trends and how those have changed. Significant drop in baptisms, marriages, and also a decrease in burials. But it's worth noting, right, that we've crossed a place where we used to do more baptisms than burials, and now we do more burials than baptisms. I think it's worth looking at this data in the context of the wider population data for the US. So that graph on the right-hand side under where it says membership, that's a graph of the membership of the Episcopal Church. That peak there in the middle is in 1965. And then if you look on the left there, that green line is the birth rate in the United States. Funny thing there, peak is about the same time the membership of the Episcopal Church peaked. That blue line there is, of course, the number of live births total. So obviously the population of the United States has not shifted over, has not decreased the way the membership of the Episcopal Church is. So there are plenty of people. In fact, the 1960 census had a population of 179 million. The 2020 census had a population of 329 million. So we have tremendous opportunity for growth as a church. It just won't come as easily as it did in the 1950s and 60s. Right? Our growth was because the people in our pews were having more children than they do now. So I think it's always worth telling that story to save people from thinking that our grandparents were so much better at evangelism than we were. It's really was about the birth rate. And so now we have an opportunity to do growth differently. All right. So let's look at some of the demographics for our membership. And thank you to the Institute and to Carissa McCoskey in particular for some wonderful analysis and graphics of our data. So perhaps this will not surprise you. If you've been in an Episcopal church, this will not surprise you. The vast majority of our membership is over, the majority of our membership is over 65, and about 3/4 of it is over 35. So we have a significant imbalance in terms of ages of who are in our pews. But I think the piece, and especially for this conversation today about small churches and vitality, is looking at the percent of ASA, so that's average Sunday attendance, to membership and groups. So this graph that says in a small congregation with an average Sunday attendance of less than 50, which is the majority of Episcopal congregations, 2/3 of those members are in church every week. Whereas the bigger the church gets, the smaller the percentage of members who are in church every week. So what it teaches us is that we have a very dedicated membership in our small congregations that are committed to being there and committed to being a part of the community on a more regular basis than the overall in the larger communities. So what else is true in our congregations? So as I said, the vast majority of our congregations, 55% of our congregations, have an ASA under 50. But those only make up 1/4, 24% of our membership. So the vast majority of our people go to big congregations. The vast majority of our congregations are small. Also worth noting that those small congregations do not have a comparable share of the resources, right? They're 55% of our congregations, but they only have 17% of the plate and pledge. And not all of them have endowments. And the aggregate total of endowments, parish endowments in the Episcopal Church, not including Trinity Wall Street, that's a separate entity, is about 5 billion. And so our small congregations don't have a comparable share of that either. They have only about 1/4 of the endowment funds held at the congregational level. So there are lots of congregations, then not as many people and not as many resources in our small congregations. Oftentimes, I think we have a tendency to equate small and rural, but in fact, the vast majority of congregations in the Episcopal Church are not in rural areas. They are in urban or suburban areas. So an urban area, according to the census, being an area greater than 50,000, with a population greater than 50,000. Micropolitan is 10 to 50,000. And then rural is communities under 10,000. And only 12.5% of our congregations are in communities that small. And those, as you can see, the vast majority of our folks worship in congregations that are in urban settings. So our small congregations are not just in sparsely populated areas. And this raises important questions about how we can help our congregations to do more to connect with their neighborhoods and the communities around them. And how do the various contexts, even if they might fit in the same category on this graph, how do we help provide vitality and enhance the vitality for those small congregations, given the diversity of contexts? All right. Oh, and I will now turn it over to Erica for the United Church of Christ context.
Thank you so much, Molly. So I am now going to share some data similar to what Molly just shared about the Episcopal Church, but share it for the United Church of Christ, so you have some sense of comparison And then we're going to move into a discussion of some of the predictors and measures of vitality and how those look for small congregations in both the UCC and the Episcopal Church. So for the United Church of Christ context, we are an entirely US-based denomination, so we don't have as many fun maps as Molly did. And our denomination is primarily focused in the New England region, the Middle Atlantic, and also the Great Lakes region. So that portion of the Midwest. So one area where a high density of our churches overlaps with the Episcopal Church is in the New England area. However, unlike the Episcopal Church, we don't have as many churches in the Southeast, but we do have quite a few congregations in the Middle Atlantic and Midwest. And Pennsylvania is actually our state with both the highest number of UCC members and the most UCC congregations. The United Church of Christ is a smaller denomination than the Episcopal Church. We currently have just over 700,000 members and about 4,600 churches. So we're a little less than half the size of the Episcopal Church. And our denomination was formally founded in 1957, which brought together a number of different traditions. However, I would note that in thinking of some of the longer arcs of the data trends that we see, while these graphs of our congregation and membership trends over time start around the time of the founding of the UCC, we know that many of these trends actually predate the founding of the UCC and were actually present in some of our constituent denominations. And in fact, our oldest churches actually date back to the early 1600s. So like the Episcopal Church, we've actually been around in the US for quite some time. And so while we are also not the largest denomination, we've had a presence in this country for about the last 400 years or so. Like the Episcopal Church, we really are a church of small churches. So this graph is looking at percentage of UCC churches by congregation size. And you can see that even between 2012 and 2022, we've increasingly become a church with small membership churches. So currently about a quarter of our churches have a membership of 1 to 50. And if you're looking at churches in even between 1 and 100 in membership, that's about half our churches. And if you're looking at worship attendance, we are even more so a church of small churches, and about 2/3 of our churches have an average weekly worship attendance of 1 to 50 people. With our participants, the distribution of age looks very similar as the Episcopal Church. Most of our church participants, almost half of them, tend to be senior adults. The next largest share of age are middle adults. And then the remainder, third, is our children, youth, and young adults. So like the Episcopal Church, demographically, we also tend to have older people in our pews. But we do have some really interesting data that we found on small churches and some things that do suggest that, despite some of these trends where we are seeing maybe fewer people involved in our congregations overall and smaller congregations, we are seeing that in many of these cases, there's some hints that we have some really vital small congregations, and there's some really exciting things happening in some of our small congregations. So the first slide I'm going to show you has this graph, which shows average percentage of worship attendance to membership by size. So like Molly was showing, in the Episcopal Church, where they had the highest ASA compared to membership for the smallest churches, this is also true within the UCC. So while not necessarily everybody who attends Sunday worship service is a member, using that as a proxy, we see that about 75% of people attending worship on a Sunday are making up the membership of the church, and that number actually drops quite precipitously as you go up in church size. So it seems that our smallest churches also tend to have the most engaged membership. And this is trend is further strengthened when looking at volunteerism within the UCC. So we also looked in the last couple of years at looking at volunteerism by membership size, in part because we suspect that volunteerism is one of the things that might be contributing to congregational vitality. And if we look at volunteers in three different ways, we look at church members volunteering at church members volunteering in the community, and community members volunteering at the church, who are in fact not church members. We see the highest ratios of that kind of participation in our smallest churches. So you can see on the left side of each of these graphs, the churches with 1 to 50 members also have these really high engagement rates of volunteers, both within the congregation and people coming from outside the congregation. So to me, this further suggests that there is a lot of vitality and connection in our small churches. And in many cases, these small churches are also quite connected with their communities. So now I'm going to be talking a little bit about overall vitality measures and how these look in small churches. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we used for some of these analyses. So this data comes from our Faith Communities Today surveys, which both the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, have been proud to be part of for quite a long time. And part of the reason we're using this data to compare our denominations is that this data is collected in a consistent way across religious groups. So we know these were the same questions asked of both of our churches. And for this particular data we'll be talking about today, this data was collected in our 2023 FACT survey. Now, one of the things to note about this data is that this survey had fairly small sample sizes compared to what we tend to collect for our FACT surveys. So we are using this data as a way to understand what questions we should ask and study in more detail in 2025. So this is really an initial examination of variables to predict and quantify vitality that we've seen in previous studies and understand how we might use these in future studies. And our central question throughout this research is, how does vitality look different in small churches compared to larger churches? And we're using the operational definition here of small churches as 50 or fewer in weekly attendance for the sake of comparison for this study. So the first thing we're looking at is, I skipped another slide ahead, leadership fit. So leadership fit tends to be a major predictor of congregational vitality in other studies that have been done. And one thing we noted when we compared leadership fit, self-described fit between the pastor and the congregation in both the Episcopal, in Episcopal churches and in UCC churches, the smallest churches less frequently described their leadership fit with their clergy as being very good, and tended to be more commonly describing their fit with their clergy leader as good compared to, in small churches compared to looking at all churches. And this was true in both denominations. The next factor we looked at was the racial diversity of attendees. And while the Episcopal Church and the United Church of Christ are both predominantly white denominations, we did note that actually in our smaller churches, there tends to be a slightly higher level of racial diversity among church participants than we see in our churches overall. So there's an area in which actually our small churches are showing a little bit different pattern than some of our large churches, and having racial diversity of attendees is also something we've looked at in previous vitality studies. So this is something we noted is actually a little bit different with our small churches. Percentage of participating adult volunteers, similar to what we found in our study of UCC volunteerism, is that in small congregations, the percentage of adults volunteering was slightly higher than all churches across both denominations. And looking at overall congregational vitality, which comes from a battery of questions we've used in the Faith Communities Today survey, and is an outcome variable that I've used in vitality studies. So we looked at this for our smallest churches. One thing that we did note is that by this particular measure, overall congregational vitality tended to increase with congregational size in both denominations. So while this is really important and useful information, it also suggests to us that we think that, and maybe in some cases, small churches may need some resources to experience vitality. We also think vitality may actually just look different in small churches, because we clearly see ways where small churches have some really exciting things going on that might not be picked up in ways we've previously studied vitality. So looking at some of the constituent pieces of how we've measured congregational vitality in that scale, we did find some variations within our small churches and our denominations. So for instance, small churches tend to agree less strongly with the constituent components of this vitality scale, with one notable exception, which was being good at incorporating new people, which seems to be consistent with what we found of this high-level engagement among our smallest churches. And we did find a slight variation in some of the findings between the Episcopal Church and the United Church of Christ, which was the small Episcopal churches slightly more commonly agreed that they were actively involved in their local community, while small UCC churches slightly more commonly agreed that they were willing to change to meet new challenges. Finally, there's two other components that we were examining and trying to understand what data could help us better understand small congregational vitality. And so we looked at pandemic experiences, how congregations rated that, and we found that in both denominations, small churches were generally less commonly agreed that their church is emerging from the pandemic stronger than before. And we also found, in talking about the future, small churches in both denominations generally reported a less positive outlook on their future than all congregations. So in this data, we found some places where there's clearly some really exciting, vital things going on with our smallest congregations, and possibly some areas where we know that we might need to support our small congregations in different ways than we have been. So in this next section, Molly is going to be talking about some of these findings in greater detail, and also talking about what the implications are for congregations and how this might inform some of our research going forward.
Thanks, Erica. So there are, a lot of differences between the Episcopal Church and the UCC on many fronts. Our polity, how we worship, who has more stained glass. But there is actually so much that we share in the area when we're discussing small church vitality, because as we have discussed, both of our denominations are full of small churches. So it's important to talk about the fact that vitality in small churches looks different than the big churches, less about the leadership, more about the racial diversity and the engagement of the congregation in their ability to welcome new people. It is really notable, though, that those small congregations are struggling and that they are often less hopeful about the future. I would guess that this data informs and fits with much of what many of us know from our own day-to-day experience and our lived experience in small congregations, that not all congregations, even if they are a similar size or demographic, are alike, that there are contextual realities that mean there's no single program or single solution to help small congregations, although it is very clear that the small congregations are in need of additional financial resources, and they don't have an equal share of the finances looking at denominations as a whole. It is important to note that networking and finding ways to connect with resources in the community and share outreach where other ministries could help reduce burnout among our congregations. And of course, the more shared research we can do going forward, the better as well. And there are quite a lot of possibilities for us in terms of future research. We will, as Erica noted, continuing to explore the theme of vitality, and particularly what does vitality look like in small congregations and how is it different and how can we measure it well. We will be doing this in the 2025 Faith Communities Today survey, which will provide us a much larger sample size and the ability, as has been noted, the ability to compare across different faith traditions. We will also be seeking to put congregational data together with demographic and census data that can help us better understand both the similarities and differences of contexts for small congregations. And given the changes in population and community, we need to look at how we can ensure the continuing presence of our denominations in places where particularly we are often the only more progressive Christian community. And finally, how can we promote flourishing for all, especially for our small congregations, because they are the majority of our congregations. So thank you, and we look forward to continuing the conversation and hearing from our clergy colleagues, and as well as others' questions and answers. Thank you.
I do hope that in the coming months, perhaps in the fall or later, we'll start back with some of our webinars and certainly building use and thoughts of how one might use their buildings into the future is certainly an important one. Also, one of our researchers reminded me and us that she intends to be writing, Carissa Mikowski, on looking at those congregations that have been small for a long time, and those congregations that we've seen that have recently become small because they've lost a lot of folks, and we've seen that shift from 100 to 200 down to much smaller sizes, and that those are two different realities, and she wants to explore that a little bit further. So we should have a report coming out, hopefully in the next 3-4 months, that begins to look at some of that stuff. And I may have to leave it there at that. We've run out of time, but I want to thank all of our participants today and also those who tuned in. Another really wonderful conversation on congregational life. So thank you all very much, and thank you to those who joined us. Have a wonderful day, and Godspeed to all of you.